children are differentially susceptible to environmental influence. And I want to run you through some of that evidence to show you what's emerged, including intervention evidence. And I'm going to end with implications for the study and understanding of childcare. Let me point out that in some respect, the notion that children are differentially sensitive to their environmental experiences is not new. We've long had the notion that some children are more vulnerable to adversity than others. Maybe it's premature babies. Maybe it's babies with difficult infants. Maybe it's children coming from bad households. That for these children, when they encounter adversity, poverty, bullying, bad quality care, poor schooling, they're the ones who succumb. But other kids who don't have those inherent vulnerabilities in them don't succumb. And this is what we call the classic diathesis stress model of environmental effects. And it has prevailed in the field of human development for a good 3 or 4 decades. And as you can see, what it presupposes is that some children carry an inherent organismic risk. As I said, they may be premature, they may carry certain genes, they may have sensitive perceptual systems, whatever it may be. And other kids don't carry that risk. And when things go well in life, they function, you can't distinguish these two groups of children. They look equally well functioning. However, in the face of adversity, poverty, a depressed mother, an alcoholic father, a violent neighborhood, the ones with that latent vulnerability, it becomes manifest and they develop poorly. The others are what we call resilient. They don't respond to the adversity. They're protected from it. They may be poor, their fathers may be alcoholics, their mothers may be depressed, they may grow up in a violent neighborhood, but you wouldn't know it. They turn out just fine, all things considered. So that's our prevailing notion of diathesis. I carry some kind of vulnerability in me. Diathesis stress. When I encounter stress, I succumb. Here's the question. Why would nature craft a developmental system for generating disturbances in development? This is a model, conceptual framework that's prevailed and been very useful. I've used it myself in work for 30 years. But we never ask ourselves, does it make any sense? And so the alternative I came up with and proposed any number of years ago now is that of differential susceptibility to environmental influences. And it presupposes that actually the ones who are most vulnerable to adversity are not just susceptible to bad environmental influences, but they're disproportionately susceptible to good ones as well. That they are disproportionately developmentally plastic or malleable, for better and for worse. And in fact, my argument is, we've missed this because we've been so concerned with the effects of adversity on children. So we've been doing all our work in this lower quadrant. We've looked at kids who have bad environments, who carry vulnerabilities and don't. And we see that they differ. We call them resilient and them vulnerable. But if we start looking at variation responsiveness to support and enrichment, what we discover, so the theory goes, is that the vulnerable are not just vulnerable. They've got greater upside potential. They're more developmentally malleable. And interestingly, in the same way these guys are not just vulnerable, that they're malleable for worse and for better, notice that all of a sudden resilience is not necessarily, from this theoretical perspective, an unmitigated good. Because under positive conditions, they don't flourish, they don't thrive. They're what I would call fixed strategists. So the theory is that some of us are more responsive to environments and some of us are less. And those that are more responsive are not just more responsive in the stress sense, more likely to do badly under bad conditions, they're also more likely to flourish under good conditions. So that's the theory. The question is there any evidence? Well, when I first started looking at this question, the evidence that I could come across had to do with temperament. And then all of a sudden there was evidence about physiological reactivity, and more recently about candidate genes. So I want to run you through some evidence. It'll get somewhat repetitive to substantiate this theoretical idea. And we begin with negative emotionality as a susceptibility marker. Now, negative emotionality is very interesting because in my first 25 years in this field, being a negatively emotional infant, having a difficult temperament, was conceptualized a priori as, quote, a risk factor. If you had this risk and you grew up in a bad environment, you succumbed more than if you didn't have this risk. But we never asked ourselves, what if you have this, quote, susceptibility factor and you grew up in a good environment? Well, it turns out when we start asking and looking at that question, what do we find? Well, here's evidence looking at whether your mother is high or low in empathy, predicting your aggression and disobedience. And lo and behold, what do we see? For those who have average temperaments, whether your mother is high or low in empathy looks like it makes no difference. It's water off a duck's back. The notion that empathy affects social behavior doesn't seem substantiated. But if you're highly difficult, have a negative temperament, the theory works. If your mother's high in empathy, you have low aggression and disobedience score. If your mother's low in empathy, you have high aggression and disobedience score. So does empathy matter for how children develop according to these data? The answer is both yes and no. For some it matters, and for some it doesn't. We see further evidence here looking at a different environmental exposure, not your mother's empathy, but whether you're growing up in a high conflict or a low conflict marital environment. And again, here we're predicting change in behavior problems over time from 2 to 3 years of age. What do we find? For those kids who were low in temperamental irritability, growing up in a high conflict family, a very high conflict family, or a very low conflict family, makes no difference. For them, what's going on between their parents is water off a duck's back. For the other kids, though, it makes a big difference. These kids become increasingly disordered, show problems. These kids in low conflict become decreasingly problematical. In other words, these highly temperamentally irritable babies are affected for better and for worse, and these apparently not at all. Another example. Here we're looking at